Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone's having a happy Sunday. I'm glad that you're here to learn some things with us. My name is Amanda. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore in the Rio Grande River Valley of Albuquerque. Today, we're very pleased to be featuring one of our very favorite Burqueñas, Albuquerque authors. That's Margaret Randall. And her friend Mariana McDonald is joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. All right, two of our favorite blue states this last week, Georgia and New Mexico. Yes. Okay, Mariana is a poet, writer, scientist, and activist. Her work has been featured in many publications, including Crab Orchard Review, The New Verse News, Fiction and So to Speak, and Creative Nonfiction and Journalism in In Motion magazine. She and Margaret have worked together on this new project, Dominga Rescues the Flag. We're going to learn about this luminous character from Puerto Rican history. Margaret Randall, as you know, is a very prolific author, having written hundreds of books now. Most recently, My Life in 100 Objects, which we did a very fun show for a few weeks ago, and also her memoir, I Never Left Home. Please do check out these books on our website. We are getting by right now with your orders online. We've been closed for browsing for the whole pandemic, and as you might have heard, New Mexico has shut down again. So we are shipping books to your home, and I believe you can come pick them up for curbside service. Our curbside hours are Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday from 10 to 2, and Wednesday from 2 to 6. I'll put all this information for you in the chat, and you're always free to check out our website where you can find today's book and many other things that your heart desires. The website is Bookworks without the O's. So it's BKWRKS.com. All right, Mariana and Margaret are going to talk a little bit about their new book, Dominga Rescues the Flag. They're going to do some reading, and then we will cap out the event with your questions. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat at any time. You can raise your hand, you can send me a message. If you'd like to speak to the authors directly, we're happy to accommodate whatever you are comfortable doing. So Mariana, welcome. Margaret, hello again. How are you ladies doing?
Great.
Great. Glad to be here.
Take it.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for hosting this important event, Amanda, you and Bookworks. This event is happening during Puerto Rican Heritage Month. And as you noted, today what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about Dominga's Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico today, and we'll follow by Margaret talking about creating Dominga's story. And then we'll each do some reading from the actual book, which this is what it looks like. And of course, you can get it from Bookworks. So, Dominga de la Cruz was a Black working-class Puerto Rican woman born April 22nd, 1909 in Ponce, Puerto Rico. It was the time of entrenchment and consolidation of U.S. colonial control of Puerto Rico, just 11 years after the U.S. invasion of the island, July 25th, 1898. Dominga was born into the poverty and hardship that blanketed the whole island. Dominga suffered this poverty directly and profoundly. Her two daughters died of malnutrition. She questioned why and how this should happen, why such horrible things happened to her, and that questioning led to the nationalist movement. Opposition to the U.S. presence in Puerto Rico developed rapidly under the leadership of a brilliant young Harvard-educated Black man from Ponce named Pedro Albizu Campos, who was elected head of the Nationalist Party in the 1920s and was the leading representative and voice of the independence movement for decades. Campos declared, "The Yankees have been at war against the Puerto Rican nation and have never acquired the right to anything in Puerto Rico, nor is there any legal government in Puerto Rico, and this is incontestable. one would have to knock to pieces all the international rights of the world to validate the invasion of the US and Puerto Rico and the present military occupation of our national territory. Dominga de la Cruz was a bright, bold, and daring young woman who joined the Nationalist Party in 1933 at age 24 and became a leading activist. She was one of the party's most prominent women members and a champion of women's rights, pushing for women's full incorporation into the national liberation struggle. Dominga was drawn to Albizu's leadership, his character and eloquence, and in the 30s, she became a protege of the great nationalist leader. She even baptized him by giving him the nickname El Maestro, the teacher, which stuck. The 30s was a time of great social upheaval in Puerto Rico. The nationalist movement grew as people witnessed the fiery embodiment of Puerto Rican consciousness, which was Albizu Campos. His insistence on Puerto Rico's independence struck a resonant chord in the Puerto Rican people who suffered extreme poverty and degradation. It was also a time of great repression. The US feared the nationalist response to the island's growing crisis. Puerto Rico's US appointed Governor Blanton Winship made no attempt to conceal plans to wage war against the nationalists. In 1936, Winship arrested the top Nationalist Party leaders, including Albizu Campos, on trumped-up charges of seditious conspiracy. The Ponce Massacre, March 21st, 1937. The demonstration in Ponce that Palm Sunday in 1937 was called by the Nationalists to protest the imprisonment of their leaders and to commemorate the end of slavery on the island. Despite an island-wide ban on demonstrations, the mayor of Ponce granted a permit only to renege it on Winship's orders shortly before the march was to begin. The Nationalists decided the demonstration would go on, permit or no. As the procession began, a single bullet fired into the crowd quickly turned into a barrage. And for nearly 15 minutes, US-supported troops fired on the marchers, the Nationalists, and passers-by leaving church that Palm Sunday. The horror of those minutes was indelibly written on the pages of Puerto Rican history and the history of the Americas. Even those who had no qualms about the US occupation of Puerto Rico had to admit it was a massacre. Dominga's daring rescue of the Puerto Rican flag in the midst of machine gun fire that Sunday won her a place in history, as well as persecution and exile. The level of persecution she faced in Puerto Rico became life-threatening, and Dominga was forced into exile in Mexico. There she lived and fought until once again political persecution forced her to move, this time to Cuba in 1962, where she was welcomed with open arms. Dominga was a cultural worker in Cuba for many years, often giving poetry recitals as she had done in Puerto Rico. Her talent and skills as a declamadora, or performer of poetry, were renowned and brought her adoring audiences all over the world. Dominga de la Cruz died in Havana, Cuba on November 25th, 1981 at the age of 72. Puerto Rico today. Puerto Rico remains a colony today, still reeling from the destruction of Hurricane Maria, along with a series of damaging earthquakes from last December through January 2020, and an uncontrolled coronavirus pandemic. After Hurricane Maria, people in Puerto Rico were without electrical power and drinkable water for over a year, and much of Maria's damage persists to this day. The US and colonial governments claimed that only a few people died from the hurricane, but studies revealed that between 3,000 and 4,645 people perished in the wake of the hurricane and the government's shamefully incompetent response. The disaster of Maria and the US government's paper towel tossing reaction to it followed decades of damaging colonial policies like the Jones Act and reckless vulture capitalist investment practices that gave full rise to a full-blown economic disaster, leaving Puerto Rico with over 70 billion in unpayable and odious debt. The US Congress's response to worried investors was the passage in 2016 of Promesa, which installed an unelected fiscal control board known as the Junta to oversee restructuring of the debt. In practice, the Junta has focused on measures that include cuts in pensions, the closure of hundreds of schools, reduction of basic social and health services, and other assaults on the island's people. In the midst of it all, the Puerto Rican people continue to carry on the fight for freedom from colonial domination. They've had important victories. A broad united front led the long battle to get the US Navy out of Vieques, ending 50 plus years of the US Navy using Vieques for bombing practice. And that forced the Navy's exit May 1st, 2003. A similar united front was also built in the campaign to win the release of political prisoner Oscar Lopez Rivera on May 17th, 2017. And in July 2019, a united Puerto Rico took to the streets for weeks, successfully demanding the ouster of corrupt Governor Ricardo Rosselló. These victories involve many sectors and movements in Puerto Rico, in addition to the independence movement. Among these are united efforts of students and women, environmentalists, agroecologists, LGBTQ people, diverse cultural sectors, and Boricuas of African descent. The Afro-descendant movement has grown in Puerto Rico and throughout the Americas. In Puerto Rico, it exalts the ancestors of today's movements, those Afro-Boricua patriots who left a mark on Puerto Rico's history, like Pedro Albizu Campos and Dominga de la Cruz. I had the great honor and privilege of meeting Dominga in the summer of 1978 when Margaret introduced us, and I first learned about Dominga's story. When I asked her about her action and her bravery, Dominga's answer was simple: I did my duty. This is the context of Dominga's story. It's a story of resistance, the pulse beat of Puerto Rican history. Dominga de la Cruz leaping into the gunfire to retrieve the Puerto Rican flag is Puerto Rico in struggle. And now we will hear from Margaret about the creation of Dominga's story.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, Amanda, for doing this once again. Thank you to Bookworks, which we really need to support, as we need to support all independent bookstores these days, especially. So I'll just tell you a little bit about how I met Dominga and how I managed to be fortunate enough to record her story. I've never thought about it as creating her story, but rather just recording her words, her life. So I lived in Cuba from the fall of 1969 through the end of 1980. And I had written a number of books about women's lives. And Dominga called me on the telephone one day. She must have gotten my number somewhere, perhaps from my friend Flavia Rivera, who was the representative of Mari Bras in Cuba at the time. Dominga said she'd seen my first book about Cuban Women Now. So this must have been after 1972 when the Cuban edition of that book appeared. She knew that I did oral history. She asked if I would be interested in recording her story. She said she was tired of being referred to as, quote, the woman who picked up the flag at the Ponce Massacre, unquote. She said, I've had a whole lot of life before and after that movement, and I want people to know about it. I was thrilled, of course. I went to her apartment to meet her, and we began getting to know one another. Then we made a schedule for regular visits. I used a tape recorder. It was one of those old clunky ones that we had back then. I taped all our conversations, transcribed them, and as was my policy with all my oral history work, gave the transcripts to those I interviewed for feedback, corrections, and so forth. I don't really remember how many sessions we had, but I'm thinking at least 20. I know that my small son, Gregory, who was maybe 12 or 13 at the time, sometimes came with me, which was why I dedicate the book to him. I realized how important it would be for young people, especially, to learn Dominga's history, a history that was so often absent from textbooks. And at least once, I invited my photography mentor, Ramon Martinez Grandal, we called him Grandal, along with me. And that's when he took the series of images that appear in the original edition of the book, which was published by Huracan in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, none of those tapes exist any longer. Back then, I often had to use tapes again and again because I didn't have enough, and it wasn't possible to buy them in Cuba at the time. I remember being very impressed by Dominga, her humility, her selflessness, and the fact that she had actually lost 2 children to hunger. That must have been the first time someone told me that. I also just plain liked her. She had a great sense of humor. I think it's important to point out that Dominga was not a passive teller of her story. She was interested in being involved not only in the telling, but in how I approached the retelling. When she read the transcript, she would make interesting comments and suggestions. She was curious about the methodology involved in doing oral history and asked lots of questions about that. I remember each session as being around 2 to 3 hours. I'd listen and record, occasionally asking questions until she got tired. But I often got tired before she did. Her story naturally divided itself into sections, different moments in her life, her affiliation with Pedro Albizu Campos, and her obvious reverence for him, her life as a mother and as a worker, and finally her exile in Cuba, always mentioned with deep gratitude to the Cuban Revolution for having given her a safe haven. I also remember her generosity. She always brewed fresh coffee when I appeared. Thinking back, I imagine that she may have had access to the special store for foreigners that existed in those years. Or maybe not. I'd rejected that special ration book, so only had the Cuban rations. Still, coffee was always at a premium, even for foreigners, and it was noteworthy that she never failed to offer it, that Latin American hospitality, notable even in homes that had only the barest necessities. So those are sort of some of my memories, which I confess they're fading with the years. Doing this book with Mariana has been wonderful because it's revived those memories and it's revived my images of Dominga and my admiration for her, a poor, Black, barely working class woman who read in the tobacco factories. That's, some of you may know, a tradition in countries that make cigars and cigarettes. They always have a reader in the factories who has a beautiful voice and who can read all day long as the workers work. They read the news, they read novels, poetry. And she also, as Mariana said, was a declamadora. She recited poetry in other venues as well. So I think that Mariana and I have planned to each read a little bit from the book. So you go first, Mariana, and then I'll go second.
Get Mariana unmuted. Okay. We can't hear you yet, Mariana.
Oh, that's weird.
There you are.
Okay, sorry.
Now we can.
Okay, yeah, Margaret, I thought we were gonna do it the other way around because you were talking about her childhood.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do that. Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, I'd like to say one other thing while I have the microphone. I'd just like to give a shout out to you, Mariana, because although we have produced this book together, and I produced the original all Spanish version so many years ago, Mariana really did the 90% of the work on this book. I was busy with several other book publications, and I just kept sort of saying, no, you'll have to do it, you'll have to do it. And she did it. And so I really want to give that shout out to you, because I think the fact that this beautiful book exists is basically due to your efforts. So I'll read a first few pages of Dominga's testimony as I recorded it so many years ago, and as it now appears in this book. She started by telling me, "You might not believe it, but it seems to me I didn't have much of a childhood or even a youth. I was born mature. I don't know if you get what I mean. I was born old. I don't remember much of my youth, just the struggles, and the same with my childhood. My parents died young. I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I can't even remember their faces. There were 6 of us in all, and I was one of the youngest. My brothers and I were farmed out to different families to be raised. I was lucky enough to stay, at least for a while, with 2 families who were friends of ours. They were pretty politicized people for that time. They wanted their country to be independent, even though they were sort of bourgeois. Of course, at that time, the petty and grand bourgeoisie wanted the island to be independent, so they could even get richer off the sweat of the workers. I'm a working class woman, born in the Buenos Aires district of Ponce on April 22nd, 1909. A worker, in spite of having spent a few years in homes that were better off economically after the death of my parents. They died almost together. My father, I think from some disease of the kidneys, and since they were an old-fashioned couple and neither could live without the other, when her husband died, my mother forgot about us and went and died too. I was raised away from all the rest of my remaining family. They took me to stay with my godmother, a woman who had married a Spaniard and who, I guess you could say, was pretty cultured. She took on proteges among the young people at the time, always went to hear promising artists, attended the theater, gave gifts to the principal artists. So I grew up among all that. I used to hear her play the piano. She played quite well. And from the time I was little, I would listen to the work she played. I listened to the older girls when they gathered and recited. And so as a little girl, I became aware of the art of reciting. Maybe that's why I liked it, why I still like it so much. My grandmother had a library where I could choose books by the best poets like Ramón de Campoamor, Victor Hugo. I read the Contemplations by Victor Hugo when I was still pretty small, but I understood a bit of it. They used to go away in the hot season, July and August, to a beautiful place in the country. I liked nature. I liked to see the trees, the river, everything, as if I could understand it somehow. I learned a couple of poems of Juan de Dios Pesa, the Mexican poet, and when I was alone and nobody could hear, I would recite them. My audience was the river, the trees swept by the wind. That was my favorite audience. I went to school at that time, but not for long. I was bored. The teacher, the discipline, they said later, excuse me for saying this, but they told me I was rebellious because I was intelligent. I don't know about that, but I was bored. I liked poems and such best, not arithmetic. Also, because of the Yankee influence in Ponce, the schools began to have mixed classes with boys and girls together. There were problems with that because of people's backgrounds and the imposition of a strange culture without explanation. Of course, it was the girls who were kept home from school. I got to the 4th grade and they took me out. After that, I studied at home, but for a very short time. My grandmother and her husband died shortly thereafter. It was a confusing time, but I understand more about it now. The issue of North American imperialism was in the air. I can understand it now. They had a coffee plantation and it was ruined. I later heard Don Albizu explain those setbacks for my people. I believe the North Americans devalued the dollar and people were ruined because they didn't listen to Don Rosendo Martinez Cinturon when he said, "Don't sell the earth, don't sell the land." Maybe they didn't pay attention because they wanted to get out of debt. And that brought on the fiasco of that first stage in Puerto Rico. In the middle of all that, the coffee disaster, the death of that family, I went to live with my brothers, poor people who raised pigs and so forth. I spent my time working with all that. I got malaria because I was not used to that kind of life and the change was so abrupt. I would get the chills out in the fields and lie down on the ground until they went away. By chance, because of the deaths of my parents, I had lived away from that reality for a time. But that reality is the norm in our countries. How many women, how many men are born and die in that life? How many? That's why I said I don't really remember having a childhood, just pieces of one. So later, Dominga goes on to say, so that's how I grew up, matured, became a young lady, as they say in Puerto Rico, and I began to work in the factories, in workshops where they made embroidered blouses. I worked with my older sister. Puerto Rico is famous for its embroidery, very fine work that is possible, as in other so-called, quote, underdeveloped, unquote, countries, because the workforce is practically enslaved. But you can't imagine what that work was like. Day after day, we worked by the light of a paraffin lamp until 2 a.m. and badly fed. I was in Mayaguez with my sister, practically the only place I could go. I think Mayaguez had more tuberculosis than any other city because there was no food and there was a lot of that needlework. We were working in those conditions when Albizu Campos began to make things clear. At that time, I still didn't have, no, I didn't know. It's not that it wasn't there, but I just didn't know what the class struggle was. It wasn't any picnic to work till midnight by lamplight for the sweatshops. You see, we did the work at home. They brought us up lots of work and we got paid less because the intermediary who brought the lots and had us do the work collected a commission. We suffered double exploitation. I didn't understand the class struggle, but I sure understood my own misery. Sure, maybe I thought it was my problem, but I was rebellious by inclination, and I didn't want to go on working there. So they took me to a cigar factory where some friends of my sister were working. I knew how to read, and they said I read pretty well for being so young, because our language was a little garbled at that time, no? And I read pretty well, so I went to the workers in a chinchal, as they call it, a cigar factory. All the terrible things that happened to women at that time happened to me too. A woman had to find a husband to be able to eat. So I found mine and got married. Don't think I loved him, no way. I had a good education, maybe too good in some ways. When I was a little girl, they talked about a lot of things that were maybe too lofty for me. So I was a little too fussy, not to find a rich man or even a well-off one. No, no, no. The sexual thing wasn't very clear for me. That's it. For me, it was if it didn't exist. Maybe you'll think it's incredible, but that's the way it was. Now, I had to find a man because, married or not, I had to get help to get by financially. I didn't understand why things were that way. I just followed the pattern without understanding. Although I rebelled, that's for sure. I didn't know against what, but I rebelled. So that, I hope, will give all of you some just taste of the book, along with what Mariana is going to add. And then we can have a discussion.
Okay, wow, that's such, I love that part of the book that you just read, Margaret. It's just amazing. So I'm going to read from chapter 5, which is about what happened in Ponce. It was Palm Sunday of the year 1937. We left Mayagüez in rented buses. I remember they were red. Through the bus windows, we saw other red buses pass by very close, the police buses, and the police were smiling as they went by. Of course, they knew what was about to happen, but we did not. The ride from Mayagüez to Ponce took about 2 hours. When we arrived, we met in a house. We saw police there too, all around, but we were used to that, to the police coming in and searching our houses. They had raided my house twice since Albizu had been in jail. They went through everything. We gathered in the offices of the Nationalist Council. It was 1 p.m. We saw our leaders arguing, coming and going. We learned later that they had gone to the mayor's office because he had given permission for the demonstration that day, and a quarter of an hour beforehand, he ordered the permit suspended. Finally, our leaders gave the order and we all set out, women as well as men. At first, it was agreed that women would not go out, but later they decided we would. Even today, Margaret, we have to fight for our right to struggle. When we formed ranks in the street, the police were there too, in the order they'd planned beforehand. Then we were on our way with our flags and all, and a young girl said to me, "Hi, Dominga, look at their guns." Poor thing, she was really scared. I told her, "Yes, I see them, but we have to go forward." I don't mean to claim I wasn't afraid, Margaret. Maybe I was, but more than anything, I was angry. So we went ahead, the cadets of Ponce in front, those of Mayagüez next, and then the women, first those of Ponce, and then us with our flags. They ordered the hymn La Borinqueña to be played, and we stood at attention when we heard it. Then Cadet Lopez de Vitoria said, "Eyes front, ready. Forward march." When he said this, he didn't know what was before us. We marched and all the guns began to fire. I still don't know, Margaret, what happened that day, why I wasn't killed. I was out in the open and I heard it when they released the safety catches on the machine guns. At that moment, I looked and I saw a lot of people throw themselves on the ground, because from a distance, they were throwing tear gas bombs. I don't know where they came from. I felt strangled. As the bullets kept coming, the people in front kept falling. I didn't look at the police or at who was firing. I was running to save myself when I see someone cross and fall wounded. And in that second, I see the flag on the ground. So I picked up the flag, all covered with blood, and went on with it. I picked it up and went on my way. And then before us, before our eyes, the dead torn to pieces at our feet, because they say that there they used for the first time those explosive shells that Mussolini had. A little girl who came to see the demonstrations with her parents died too. She was ripped apart by a bullet. Apart from the 22 dead, there were many wounded. One of them, a young man, wrote on a wall with his blood, "Long live the Republic, down with the assassins." We spent the whole afternoon of the massacre in the police station. The entire people united behind us. Later, there was the Hayes investigation with Mr. Hayes of the American Civil Liberties Union. My turn to testify came one day at 2 a.m. The place was packed with people from the university, intellectuals, everyone waiting for the statements. When it was my turn, I just told what I saw exactly and simply, and that I picked up the flag on my way. Then Hayes said, "And why, if you were in danger of death, did you pick up that flag instead of running for your life?" And I answered, "Because my maestro taught me that the flag of the homeland should never fall on the ground." And then he asked me, who is your maestro? And I said, Dr. Don Pedro Albizu Campos. After that, he would stand up whenever I passed by. And he wrote in the newspaper El Mundo something like this: "You have to see her, young, Black, immutable in her dignity." Mr. Hayes ended his report with the words, "This was a massacre." Makes me cry.
Thank you, Mariana.
Yeah.
I think that gives a very good idea of not only her testimony, but who Dominga was.
Right. Right. Quite an extraordinary person.
Both of those sections just really had me riveted for different reasons.
Yeah.
So these are her own words that you all transcribed. Is there a lot of context written along with the book, or is it mainly, could you just tell us a little bit more about what's inside and also maybe the bilingual aspect of it?
Well, I can address that, Amanda. I used as much of her testimony as possible, but the book is not only her testimony. Even the original Spanish-only edition had a lot of context. And then Mariana did an extraordinary job of writing both an introduction and an epilogue to sort of situate Dominga's story and the Puerto Rico of those years in the context of today. So I think the book does a great job of both telling Dominga's story or letting her tell her own story, and also giving that context. As far as the English is concerned, the translation is by Christina Mills, who is a dear friend and also lived in Cuba at that time. It's a very good translation, and I think it does total justice both to Dominga's story and to the context of the book.
One of our participants would like to know how you ended up in Cuba, Margaret, and how you met Dominga in the first place.
I ended up in Cuba because I had been living in Mexico from 1961 to 1969. And the Mexican student movement took place in the summer and fall of 1968. And I took part in that movement. As some of you may remember, 1968 was a year in which students and young people were rising up all over the world, here at Columbia University in New York, and what's called the Paris Spring, in South Africa as well, in Soweto. And so Mexico was just another example of that. But in Mexico, the government repression of our movement was particularly brutal because Mexico was getting ready to host the Summer Olympics of 1968. Mm-hmm. And as our movement progressed, they had built all these sports installations, these new hotels, people were canceling. And I guess the Mexican government was fearful that its investments would be lost. So on October 2nd of 1968, they cracked down on a peaceful demonstration of thousands of protesters and fired into that protest for 5 hours without stopping. The official government report said that 26 people had died. I believe it was closer to 1,000. So, you know, that put an end to our movement. The Olympics went on as planned. And the following year, 1969, those of us who survived, who were not in prison or in exile or dead, were making plans to celebrate the year anniversary of our movement and to commemorate our dead. And I was in the midst of those plans when paramilitary operatives came to my house and at gunpoint stole my passport, and I had to go underground. So so that's how I was forced underground. It took me a while to figure out a way to get out of the country underground, but I finally did. And that's why and how I got to Cuba. I took refuge in Cuba, as many people did in those years. My children, I actually sent my children there beforehand. And then the man I was living with at the time and I caught up with them. Cuba took in literally thousands of children in those years, children of people who were in prison, who had died, who were on the front lines of struggle in all over the world, really, or at least all over the third world. So I had a hard time getting out of Mexico, but I finally did, and I traveled to Cuba via Czechoslovakia, which was the only way I could do that in that time, and lived in Cuba for 11 years. And you ask if I had any difficulties leaving. No, I was always a free agent in Cuba. I, you know, was treated wonderfully by the Cubans, and lived there, as I say, for 11 years with my 4 kids. They went to school there. And, but I, you know, I had met some of the Sandinista revolutionaries from Nicaragua around 1974, 1975. And I was curious about what was going on in Nicaragua. And so I went there to do field work for a book of mine that later became Sandino's Daughters, and returned to Cuba, wrote the book in Cuba, but decided to move on to Nicaragua, which was a country that posed new challenges and new experiences different from the ones in Cuba. And so when it came time that I decided to move on to Nicaragua, I just said goodbye to Cuba, not completely goodbye, because 3 of my 4 children remained, and I went on to Nicaragua. I don't know if that answers your question.
The short version.
Yeah, the short version.
All right.
I'll make a plug for my memoir now. Duke University Press this year published my memoir, which is called I Never Left Home, Poet, Feminist, Revolutionary. And, you know, the book tells all of these stories in much greater detail. So if people are interested, I encourage you to look for that book.
Yes, if you go to our website and search for Margaret Randall, you can see what we have on hand. We have several of her books. She's written lots of stuff on Cuba, including the biography of Aide Santa Maria, another very provocative, lesser known woman of import. Okay, we've got a question coming in from Laris Feliciano. Can you please speak to how the events of the book relate to the current political climate in PR?
Well, I'll take a crack at that if you like. I think the fundamental thing to understand is the Puerto Rican people have never stopped fighting. And so there is a continuity of the struggle. What's been happening in the past few years in response to the horrible way that the Puerto Rican colonial government responded to the hurricane, and there have been a number of scandals. One of the well, gosh, there've been so many, but one of the biggest ones was that after Maria, for months, as I said earlier, people didn't have water. People didn't have a lot, and there were supplies that were being sent from all over the world to Puerto Rico. And several months after the worst of the hurricane's impact had been felt, I mean, I can't remember the exact date, but suddenly there were all these warehouses discovered that were full of supplies. They were full of water and medicine and food and clothing for people that were desperately needed. And I think there ended up being something like, I don't know, 20 of these warehouses discovered. And apparently what had happened is the corrupt government, people in the corrupt government thought, oh, this would be a nice thing for me to have when I need to give some kind of, bribe or gift to somebody for treating me a way that I want them to treat me. So it was sheer corruption that caused this. So there has been tremendous outrage of the Puerto Rican people. And we saw that a year ago, July, in the summer of 2019, when hundreds of thousands, if not as many as a million people in Puerto Rico took to the streets, and it was extraordinary. So I feel like that there is that continuity. And then what's happened most recently, which actually, interestingly enough, a similar thing has happened with votes from the recent election, which is somewhere between 100 and 200 maletines, or suitcases, or large cardboard boxes of votes were found last week that hadn't been counted. So it's another example of the tremendous. It's not just incompetence; it's heinous corruption that's been going on. So in the election that happened the same day as our election here, well, there was an interesting development in that there were 5 parties running for office. And Puerto Rico has suffered for years from basically a 2-party system, if that sounds familiar to anybody. But what happened in this election is within that system was repudiated because, as I say, there were 5 parties. Besides the PPD and the PNP, there was the Puerto Rican Independence Party, the Movement of Citizens Victory, and Dignidad. All were in the mix. And the person who so-called won the election for governor is Pierluisi, but he only got 30% of the vote. And so in a recent talk with folks from Puerto Rico, I learned that many people feel like, no, what this vote means is 70% of the people did not want the old system. And that's why this guy only got 30% of the vote, but he'll be considered the governor. The other thing that took place on the elections was a referendum on statehood, not statehood versus X, but just statehood yes or statehood no. And the independence movement and allied forces waged a pretty rigorous vote no campaign. And so the outcome was 48% against statehood and 52% for statehood. So on the surface, that looks like, oh, okay, so people want statehood. But no, understanding what that means in terms of the history of plebiscites, that's pretty much of a draw. And I think that my sense is that many Puerto Ricans feel that the election results indicate that people are completely fed up with what's been going on. They are willing to explore the possibility of independence or some kind of different situation from what exists now. And that the Puerto Rican people are really looking for some change. And they've been through an experience of getting rid of a corrupt governor through struggle. And that is a remarkable and unforgettable experience the Puerto Rican people have had. So I think, unfortunately, one thing that's happened in the United States is there have been people who are so-called progressive here who say, oh, well, we need to, Biden won, so now we need to, among other things, give DC statehood and Puerto Rico statehood. And that's just absolutely ill-informed and, frankly, opportunistic and failing to pay attention to what's actually happening on the ground in PR.
Mariana, can I just break in for a moment and ask you to explain what the Puerto Rican election is with regard to our election? It happens on the same day, but do the Puerto Rican people get to vote for president?
Very good question. I saw one of the funnier comments I saw from a Republican recently was, oh, the US election can't be considered over because they haven't stopped counting the votes in Puerto Rico, which really is a remarkable reflection of stupidity, because Puerto Ricans don't vote for the US president. They vote for representatives to the Puerto Rican version of its Congress, and they vote for governor. That's what they get to vote for. And if there is a plebiscite, they vote on the plebiscite. But they have absolutely nothing to do with the US elections.
So they can fight in US wars, but they can't vote for a US president.
Exactly. The Jones Act that was passed in 1917 imposed US citizenship on Puerto Ricans just in time for conscription in World War I.
Well, thanks for that rundown, because I think that, and it's intentional, but not very much comes out about Puerto Rico in the press here. We used to have a much stronger left press in the United States. We had NACLA, and we had, back in the day, we had news sources that really paid attention to Puerto Rico, to Cuba, to other parts of the world. And that has diminished so much that it's hard, I think, for a lot of people here, unless they're particularly tuned into Puerto Rico, to really know what's going on there. So that was a great rundown. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. And you're right. It's really hard for people in the United States to understand what the U.S. government has done, quote, in their name in Puerto Rico. People kind of have to go out of their way to find out about it. And so that's part of what we hope to do with Dominga's story, with this book, is to help people understand the reality in Puerto Rico and actually the responsibility of people in the United States to find out about what's being done in their name and to listen to the voices of the Puerto Rican people and allow self-determination and sovereignty.
I also want to just, before we have to finish, I'd like to give one more shout out, which is to Jane Norling, a wonderful West Coast painter. She now lives in Chicago, but this cover is by her, and I just think it's a great cover. It comes from a poster which she did in Cuba in 1972 for Puerto Rican Independence Day, and so she modified that poster for this cover. And also a shout out to your son, Andre, because he worked so hard to really take some very poor quality photographs, both the historic photographs which appear in the book and photographs that I took of Dominga, but had very poor negatives. And, you know, he did a great job making all of those photographs just as absolutely clear and beautiful as anyone could. So I just wanted to give a shout out to him as well.
Thank you. He also transcribed the book because, you know, that's another thing I wanted to just mention about this project. I think Amanda, you know, talked about this new project, and yes, the book is new, but Margaret and I have actually been working on this off and on for 40 years. And because when I met Dominga through Margaret in 1978, I mean, I was very active in Puerto Rican solidarity movement at the time, and I just said, "Oh, we've got to do this in English." And so Christina agreed to translate it, and you know, we started working on figuring out how we would get it published just in English in the United States. And we had many almost and many disappointing turns of events. But basically, and that's why ultimately we decided to publish it ourselves. And when we were confronted with that, we had to consider, well, wait a minute, this book is not available in Spanish anymore. In fact, neither Margaret nor I have a copy of the original version in Spanish. It just, you know, a friend of mine took it out from interlibrary loan, and that it was that copy that my son used to work on the photographs. But that book has not been available for decades. And so at a certain point we said, this book has to be bilingual. As much of a headache as that can be, doing a bilingual book, it has to be bilingual. So 40 years later, we have Dominga's story in English and in Spanish, and hopefully it will be read and enjoyed in Puerto Rico and other Spanish-speaking countries as well as here. So